Welcome back to the Judgment Files. We've got quite the landmark case today.
Yeah.
Loving v. Virginia.
Big one.
This is one that just, hits at the core of discriminatory laws and reshapes fundamental rights. And
It really does.
that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack this whole thing.
Unpack it.
Understand the arguments,
Yeah.
the story behind it,
Mm-hmm.
and why it still matters so much today.
It's a biggie.
Huge.
Huge. And you know what's so interesting about this particular case?
What's that?
Our main source
Okay.
is actually the Supreme Court's opinion from 1967.
Wow.
So we're going right to the source. We're going to see how they laid out the facts, the challenges, how they thought it through, and then how they said, you know what? Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws, those are out. 14th Amendment says no.
It is pretty amazing to be able to see the inner workings
Yeah,
of, the highest court in the land.
it is.
And especially at a time of, such intense social change.
Social change.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So to get us all on the same page, let's talk about the people at the heart of this.
Okay.
We have Mildred Jeter, a black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man,
Right.
both from Virginia.
From Virginia.
Now it's 1958.
Mm-hmm.
Virginia, you can't marry interracially.
Nope.
So they have to go to D.C. to get married.
They did. They went to D.C., got married, perfectly legal there,
Right.
came back home to Virginia to start their lives together.
And that's when things get interesting. What happens?
Well, their marriage really catches the attention of the local authorities. They get indicted
Wow.
by a grand jury for breaking Virginia's laws against interracial marriage. It's kind of hard to fathom, Back then, the state could actually step in and say no to a marriage like that.
That's wild. It's such a personal decision,
Oh, no.
And what's crazy is what the judge said at the trial. I actually have the quote here.
Okay.
He said, "Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. But for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows that he did not intend for the races to mix."
Wow.
I mean, just to hear a judge say that,
I know. Talk about justification for these laws.
it's really something. So what happened to them right away? What was the consequence?
So they ended up pleading guilty,
Oh, wow.
and the sentence was a year in jail.
A year.
But the judge offered them a deal, a suspended sentence. Basically, they could avoid jail time
Okay.
if they agreed to leave Virginia
For
for
what?
25 years. And they couldn't come back together as husband and wife during that whole time.
That's basically exile.
Exile, yeah. It was like, you can't be married and live here.
That's intense. So let's actually break down these Virginia laws a little bit.
Yeah.
What exactly were they convicted under?
So the main one was Section 2058 of the Virginia Code. That one was all about couples going to another state to get married, to
Right.
avoid Virginia's law,
Right. To get around it.
and then coming back to Virginia to live together.
Sneaky, sneaky.
And the punishment for that was spelled out in Section 2059. That's where they said interracial marriage, that's a felony.
A felony.
Felony. And you could face 1 to 5 years in prison for that.
It's crazy that getting married could be a felony.
I know, right? That's how serious they were about preventing these marriages.
Wow. So were there other laws that came into play too?
Oh, yeah, there was a whole system in place.
Okay.
Section 2057 of the Virginia Code. That one basically said any marriage between a white person and a colored person, absolutely void.
So they were just like, yep, doesn't count.
Basically. Like
Yeah.
it never happened. They didn't even need a trial to annul it or anything. It was just automatically not recognized.
So even though they had a legal marriage certificate from D.C., Virginia was like, nah, we don't care.
Exactly. So in their eyes, the Lovings were never really married.
And I remember there were also very specific rules about who was considered white and who was colored.
Yeah, they had those definitions laid out pretty clearly. Section 2054, that's where they defined a white person. They said it was someone with no trace whatever of any blood other than Caucasian.
So no mixing whatsoever.
None at all. But then, get this, they had this really interesting exception.
Oh, what was that?
For people who had, 1/16 or less American Indian blood,
So tiny bit of Native American ancestry was okay.
as long as they didn't have any other non-Caucasian blood, yeah.
That's so specific. Why would they even have that?
Well, the Supreme Court actually talked about this in their opinion. They said it came from this historical idea of wanting to recognize the descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas as part of the white race.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it? It's like this weird little loophole designed to accommodate a very specific historical narrative while still upholding this whole idea of racial purity.
And it really shows you how arbitrary these racial categories were, right?
Absolutely. Like, who decides what even counts as white?
Right. And how did they define colored person then?
Well, that one was a lot broader. Section 114 of the code just said, a colored person is every person in whom there is ascertainable any Negro blood.
Wow, so any trace at all.
Any trace. And you see the difference, right? So much detail for defining white, but for colored, it's just one sweeping statement. Really highlights the discrimination built into the whole system.
No kidding. And just to be clear, the Lovings didn't even try to argue about those racial categories. Right?
No, they didn't.
They were focused on challenging the whole idea that these laws were even constitutional.
Right, that was their fight. They were saying these laws are fundamentally wrong.
So they get sent away from Virginia.
Right.
What do? How do they fight this?
So a few years pass, they're living in D.C., and in 1963, they decide to take action. They go back to the same state trial court where they were convicted.
The bold move.
And they file a motion to have the judgment against them vacated.
Vacated?
Basically thrown out. They argued that those Virginia laws violated the 14th Amendment, you know, the one that guarantees equal protection under the law.
Makes sense.
They were saying, look, these laws are discriminatory, they're unconstitutional, you can't do this to us.
So they're fighting back. What happened in the Virginia courts? Did they get anywhere?
It wasn't quick. In fact, in '64, they actually started a whole other lawsuit in federal court. This one was a class action, meaning they weren't just fighting for themselves, but for everyone in a similar situation.
Wow, so it was a bigger fight now.
Yeah. They wanted the federal court to declare Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional.
So they were attacking on two fronts.
Exactly. But it took a while for things to move. It wasn't until January of '65 that the state trial judge finally denied their motion to vacate the sentences.
So the Virginia courts were not really on their side.
No, not really.
What about the Virginia Supreme Court? What'd they say?
So they appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeals of Virginia, but unfortunately they lost.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the court upheld the anti-miscegenation laws.
And how did they justify that?
Well, they leaned heavily on a previous case of theirs, Name v. Name from 1955. It was basically the same issue, a challenge to the ban on interracial marriage.
What were the arguments in that Name case? Like, how did they defend these laws?
Okay, so the court in Name said the state had some really important reasons to prevent interracial marriage.
Like what?
They talked about preserving racial integrity.
integrity.
Preventing the corruption of blood. They even used the term mongrel breed of citizens.
Oh.
And they said they wanted to maintain racial pride. But when you really look at it, it's clear these arguments were all about white supremacy.
It's hard to see it any other way.
It is, isn't it?
What do you think were the, underlying beliefs behind these arguments? Was it just plain racism or was there more to it?
Well, I think plain racism was definitely part of it. But there were probably also deeper fears, anxieties about social change, about disrupting the existing racial hierarchy. It wasn't just about hate. It was about control.
And didn't the Name court also talk about states' rights?
Yes. They said marriage has always been a matter for the states to decide.
The 10th Amendment argument.
Exactly. They basically said the federal government has no business interfering with who a state allows to get married.
So they're saying it's our right to be discriminatory if we want to be.
Pretty much, yeah. They were claiming total authority over marriage laws.
Wow. So the Lovings case eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the biggest stage.
It does. They made it.
What were Virginia's main arguments at that point?
Okay, so they had two main points. First, they said their laws didn't actually violate the Equal Protection Clause.
But how?
Well, they said because the punishment for interracial marriage was the same for both white and black people.
That's a pretty weak argument. Just because you punished everyone equally for breaking a discriminatory law doesn't make the law itself okay.
Right. But that was their first line of defense.
What was their second one?
They said, okay, even if you don't buy the equal punishment thing, there's still a good reason to treat interracial marriages differently.
What reason could there possibly be?
They claimed that the scientific evidence about the effects of interracial marriage was, unclear.
Unclear.
Yeah, they were saying, we don't really know if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Oh, come on.
And so they said the Supreme Court should just let the Virginia legislature decide, since they're the ones who made the law in the first place.
So basically, trust us, we know what we're doing, even if the science is shaky. How did the Supreme Court respond to all this?
Well, they weren't buying it.
Good.
They shut down that equal application argument right away. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the majority opinion, and he basically said, Just because a law punishes different races equally doesn't mean it's not discriminatory.
Right. The law itself is the problem.
Exactly. And they emphasize that the 14th Amendment is all about getting rid of any kind of racial discrimination by the states.
So that first argument just didn't hold up.
Nope.
What about Virginia trying to use history to support their case, like what the framers of the 14th Amendment intended and all that?
Oh, yeah. They tried that, too.
What do they say?
They pointed to some old debates about the 14th Amendment, like discussions about the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866.
Trying to say that the framers never intended to ban laws against interracial marriage.
Exactly. But the Supreme Court wasn't convinced. They said that those historical examples were more about specific situations, not about the overall goal of the 14th Amendment.
Which was equality.
Right. And they actually pointed to another case, McLaughlin v. Florida, where a similar argument about historical intent had already been rejected.
So the court was basically like, we're not going to get bogged down in history here. The point is to eliminate discrimination.
Exactly. They said that the Constitution needs to be interpreted in light of current society, not stuck in the past.
Makes sense. What about the Pace v. Alabama case? That's the one where the Supreme Court seemed to uphold a law that punished interracial adultery.
Right. That was a tricky one. But the court in Loving basically said we were wrong about that.
They admitted they made a mistake.
Pretty much. They said Pace had a very limited view of the Equal Protection Clause, and they'd already moved away from that kind of thinking in McLaughlin.
So they were correcting course.
Exactly. They said the Equal Protection Clause requires a much deeper analysis to figure out if a law is really discriminatory.
So at this point, the court has basically established that racial classifications are a big no-no under the Constitution.
Right.
What was their main reason for striking down Virginia's laws?
They were very clear about this. They said Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws were based solely on race. That's it.
Nothing else.
Nothing else. And these laws took away a fundamental right, the right to marry, based on nothing but the race of the people involved.
That's pretty straightforward.
It is. And the court even quoted an earlier case, Hirabayashi v. United States, where they said distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are, by their very nature, odious to a free people.
Powerful words.
They really are.
And they also emphasize how seriously they take laws based on race.
Yes, they referenced the Korematsu case.
That's the Japanese internment case, right?
Yep. And they said, look, any law that classifies people based on race, especially a criminal law, gets the highest level of scrutiny.
So the burden of proof is really on the state to justify that kind of law.
Exactly. And they have to prove that it's absolutely necessary to achieve some important goal that has nothing to do with discrimination.
And in this case, did Virginia have any such goal?
The court said no way. They found patently no legitimate overriding purpose for these laws other than racial discrimination.
It's clear they were just trying to maintain white supremacy.
Right. And the court pointed to the fact that these laws only prevented white people from marrying non-white people. There were no restrictions on other interracial marriages.
Which makes the whole intent very clear.
Exactly.
So the Supreme Court said, you can't restrict the freedom to marry based on race. That's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause.
That's right. But they didn't stop there. They also addressed another important constitutional principle.
What's that?
The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Okay, what's that all about?
Well, the court said Virginia's laws also deprived the Lovings of their liberty without due process of law.
How so?
They said the freedom to marry is not just some minor right. It's a vital personal right that's essential for happiness, and it's one of the most basic civil rights of man. They actually quoted from an earlier case, Skinner v. Oklahoma.
So basically, the right to choose who you marry is fundamental to being free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the court said denying that freedom based on race is totally against the idea of equality, so it's a violation of due process.
So it's wrong on 2 counts.
Yep. And they emphasized that the state can't interfere with the freedom to marry or not marry someone of another race. That choice belongs to the individual.
So what was the final decision?
They reversed the Loving's convictions.
Finally.
They said those anti-miscegenation laws were unconstitutional, period.
It's amazing to think how much impact this one case had.
I know, right?
It wasn't just about Mildred and Richard Loving. It was about striking down these discriminatory laws all across the country. It really shows how important the 14th Amendment is for protecting people from discrimination, especially by the states.
Absolutely. It set a powerful precedent.
And it also shows us that even laws that seem really deeply rooted, like laws that were justified by religion and tradition, can be overturned if they go against the Constitution.
And it raises some really important questions for us today.
What kind of questions?
Well, like, how do we make sure we're getting rid of all forms of discrimination, even the ones that are less obvious? How do we guarantee that everyone truly has equal protection and due process under the law?
Those are some big questions.
They are, but they're the questions we have to keep asking.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time on the Judgment Files.